changed Air Force-wide repair directives, both in TOs, AFIs, and guidance that was in the sheet metal community and the corrosion community. One of the things that I noted here, just because it's kind of personal to me, he developed heat treat storage rack for F-15 horizontal stabs, so 5 of them could be worked simultaneously. For those of you who spent time on the F-15 and the honeycomb surfaces, huge problem. To be able to work those simultaneously, very intense, and it has to be the perfect environment. The fact that Mr. Mate was able to push hard and get approval to be able to, one, develop the rack, use the rack, and be able to do this simultaneously, especially for a base that had 3 fighter squadrons, definitely a huge push for productivity here at Elmendorf. And then one less base that needed to be tended to by depot engineers as well. Within that year, he was the PACAF Outstanding Maintenance Performer Civilian Category Supervisor for that year. Didn't take him long, did it? A year later, he actually gained approval and certification to work F-15 depot work, the vertical stab in the cradle. To this day, is still a huge issue for that airplane. He went out there and worked with the engineers, proved to them that they had the capability, capacity, and consistency to be able to do that job here at Elmendorf, and they granted him the approval to do that. He describes this as one of the proudest moments in his civilian career to this day. That year, 2003, he ended up getting Lieutenant General Leo Marquez, Civilian Manager of the Year, won 3rd Wing Category 2 Civilian Manager of the Year, and his team, 2003 Air Force Productivity Enhancement Award. Pretty impressive for only 2 years into the civilian. Definitely, Mr. Mate was definitely not one to stand for status quo. When I first came to Elmendorf, or when I was first notified that I was coming to Elmendorf, they're like, you have a lot to look after between 478 plus military members, contractors, civilians, Guard, Reserve. I'm like, that's a lot to try and take in. And unfortunately for me, my civilian experience wasn't that great. I previously come from Robins Air Force Base. Huge number of civilian employees there, and I hate to say not all of them are as motivated as the civilians that we have here in this organization. And within probably the first week of being at Elmendorf, my attitude my attitude towards the civilian employees that we had here and the dedication that they brought to the fight, it completely reversed itself. And Mr. Mate was a big part of that. He definitely is a great asset for this Air Force base. One of the things that brings to the fight is consistency. Something that we don't often get in the Air Force. And a lot of most of the bases I've been to prior to this were all blue suits. So every 3 to 5 years, everything's changing over. They'll start a project and it doesn't get seen to the end. And I've been to metals tech shops and sheet metal shops where there's equipment sitting in the corner that has never been plugged in and it's covered in dust for 5 or 10 years. Just didn't know what to do. Showed up one day, we had no idea who purchased it or why. That doesn't happen here in this wing. And a big part of that is the civilian workforce that we have to be able to dedicate themselves to a project and see it to the end. But not only that, our civilians here are phenomenal in terms of innovation. They're always looking for the next level. How do we meet the mission? How do we make it better? How do we change it? And how do I teach these airmen? And that's kind of the epitome of Mr. Mate. He pushed boundaries of design, authorization, and supply. He pre-positioned F-15 vertical stab parts, so when F-15s were going into phase or had major defects, they were able to be worked on the spot. Didn't have to wait for a depot team to come up here. Didn't have to wait for supply. He established training and facility requirements for the C-17. They actually hosted the C-17 Advanced Composites office visit when they came up here. Knowing that we were transitioning into the C-17 from the C-130, he brought them up here and said, what is it that we need to do? How do we get prepared for this? What are the things that we're going to need to be able to bring to the fight to make sure we can maintain this aircraft the right way? Why did he do this? I don't know. I sat and asked, and Mr. Mate is a very humble individual. I tried to kind of conjecture on what it was. Was it just because they told him he couldn't? Was it a desire to be self-sufficient? Or was it just yet another challenge to overcome? Probably a combination of all 3 of these. But either way, he laid the groundwork for JABR and set the standard Air Force-wide on what we should be doing here in terms of fabrication flight and even beyond fabrication flight in many instances. For those of you who work in sheet metal, corrosion, and LO today, Mr. Mate was on the design team for those facilities. Not only the design for the building themselves, where they're going to be located, how they're going to be set up, and what requirements the building had to have, and what requirements were going to be in the building. From 2004 to 2007, Mr. Mate was the kind of the go-to for C-17 requirements for sheet metal, composites, corrosion, repair procedures, facility requirements and design, and actually the Corps of Engineers asked for him specifically to be on their team to make sure that they got this right. Mr. Mate also became the resident expert on LO. He was pushed to multiple different bases to learn what LO was and how we were going to have to adapt it here at Ellenborough. Mr. Ransom had a big part in pushing into those bases and making that happen. One of the best things that he could have ever done, and I think one of the reasons we're still so successful today in LO is because he went out and did that research. And not only did he go and do the research and go, okay, this is what they're doing, that's what they're doing. We need to mimic that. It wasn't, we need to mimic that. This is what they're doing right, and this is what we can improve on. And we have the opportunity now, or at that time, we had the opportunity to say, these are the things we need to make this process even better. He ID'd the must-haves and the best practices, and he became the core behind the best LO facility in the Air Force still today. Through all this development, which takes a lot of time to figure out what you need, spending time behind a computer, working with the Corps of Engineers, he still never forgot what was happening here on Jaber, or the time that we go. He ended up becoming him and his team were the PACAF expert on letter computerized equipment. And he trained folks from Kadena, Oregon Air National Guard, and Eielson. And I didn't know it at the time. I learned this about a week and a half ago that was the first time that I actually had indirect interaction with Mr. Mate. When his folks became the Eaton Leonard computerized equipment specialist, I was up at Eielson as an OPSO, and I sent my sheet metal folks down here to get trained on how to use a tube bender that sat in our shop for about 5 years. And that was the first example I had that I was like, here it is. This is how small the Air Force is and the things that he was doing and his people were doing to make sure that the Air Force was better, not just his shop and not just his base. He earned the 3rd Maintenance Group Civilian Manager and Category 2 Civilian Employee of the Year in 2005. And again, the Lieutenant General Leo Marquez Award winner, Civilian Manager in 2006. After gaining knowledge on the LO facility and processes, he actually had the opportunity to run LO for a couple of years. He established some of the procedures and practices that we're still using today. He saw SAS as something that wasn't just going to be something that we looked at, it was going to be a program that had to be managed. SAS has really come a long way, and many of the folks in this room are smarter on it than I am and ever will be. But when he first went down those bases and looked at it, they didn't treat it as the system that it needed to be. They weren't tracking it to the level that it was. Mr. Mate is definitely a numbers guy. I've learned that after talking with him. I've learned that after talking with folks in the shop. And he knew that this was going to come down to something that we had to manage on a day-to-day basis. He actually recalled, he remembered re-meeting Colonel Corcoran when he first came here as the wing commander. He remembered him as Captain Corcoran when he was here in the fighter squadron. Captain Corcoran, now Colonel Corcoran, remembered him. He says, I remember you from those meetings that we used to have. That was in part some of Mr. Mate's work, was to establish meetings, and not just within MXS or EMS at the time to figure out how we were going to manage these coding, but to go past that and go out to the AMU and ensure they knew what it was to manage and schedule LO and how it was going to affect the fixed time repair time for these aircraft. But they went a step beyond that and said, this isn't going to work if we don't have buy-in from everybody. And they made sure that the operators understood what this system was. It's not just paint on an airplane. It's not just something that you can fly with. It's not something you can ignore and then in a weekend repaint it all. And he got the operators to understand that too. And that was one of the biggest things that you're going to hear this multiple times. He was able to explain the why we do things to the people, to his customers, whoever that customer may be. At the time, it may be an airman in the shop. It might be that AMU Pro Super that's out there, or it could be one of the operators or an engineer down at depot. That was his customer being treated appropriately and understood what they needed to make sure that he got what he needed. I actually got a chance to sit down with Mr. Atkinson. He actually recalled one of these meetings as well, being a go-getter Pro Super out on the flight line, saying, we gotta push, gotta get that sorted. And he goes, I remember sitting down with Mr. Mate as well, and him telling me that, wait a minute, if you push, you'll get the sorties now, but what are you gonna have later? And it was Mr. Mate bringing him in, showing him how the numbers work, how the system works, that got him to understand that we have to manage this, just like we manage every other system.